I think in our culture in India, it's very collectivistic. Our church is our family. I always say, we don't have 911. I mean, if there's an emergency, it's your church family that comes to play. My mom, she's a pediatrician. She's a medical doctor. And I remember her coming in and she was like in tears. And my mom never cries. She's the strong doctor. And that was when I knew there was something really wrong with me. Imagine the amount of compassion if I, as a father, can have on my own daughter, how much God can have for us. We're so hard on ourselves. We just want to be at a certain level of we're talking about our prayer life. We got to be at a certain level. So when we're not, we're just too hard on ourselves. But then I look at the process of my kid. I mean, like a 1-day-old kid, I'm not expecting her to walk, not expecting her to run. And then she starts to crawl and it's like the biggest event in our lives. All of these moments are moments of celebration, like high points in our life. And I think to God, but how much God rejoices in that one step of obedience or faith that we take.
In this episode of the Wayfaring Stranger podcast, I talk with Ajit Christopher, a pastor and missions leader whose ministry spans India and the United States. Through our conversation, we explore the key differences between how Christianity is lived out in the West versus a collectivist culture like India. Ajit also opens up about his personal story, growing up as a pastor's kid, surviving a life-threatening illness that deepened his faith, and his calling into ministry. We discuss the power of storytelling and preaching, the importance of abiding in Christ, and what the Western Church can learn from cultures that rely on deep, interdependent Christian community. May this conversation challenge and encourage you to consider how faith is lived out beyond our individual experience and how the gospel transcends culture. I hope you enjoy this episode. So I guess we could start with the differences between Christianity in America and India. What do you feel like are the main differences in your experience?
Well, I think the biggest one, if I were to, let me start with the positive stuff about the United States. I mean, I just love how faith is so reasoned. I mean, when Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, there is an intellectual component to it. And I think one of the great things about the church here is people just don't believe stuff just because they were told. They want to feel for themselves, experience for themselves. And if it means a pathway you want to make your faith your own, I respect that because you really want to own it for yourself. And sometimes it feels like in our culture, Christianity is very cultural. You're born in a Christian family, you're a Christian. I remember my dad used to say, it's like, well, if you're a Christian just because you're born in a Christian family, it means you should be a car if you're born in a garage,
Yeah.
That's how it was. So, it could just become customary, it's just cultural. And I think that's something that I really learned for myself, even just being here the past 12 years in the United States, just making my faith my own in terms of what I believe. That's something that I really do love about the United States. I think the biggest difference for me is how Christianity is lived out. I think in our culture in India, it's very collectivistic. Our church is our family. I always say, we don't have 911. I mean, if there's an emergency, it's your church family that comes to play. Whatever you need. So your family, your church family becomes your real family. It's almost like what Jesus says, when Jesus' mother and brothers come to see him and they go, who are my brothers and mother? It's those who do the will of God. I mean, that becomes literal in our culture. And I think that's something that I would really love for our culture here in the United States. I mean, imagine if our church family really becomes our family. I think there's a power to it. And that's something that's the biggest difference that I see between India and the United States.
Interesting. So, and that's actually, I guess that makes a little bit of sense because I remember one of my other friends from India, David, who is also in choir with us.
Yeah.
And he was from a province. You would remember which province he was from, right?
So I think he's from Andhra Pradesh. That's the state that he was from.
That's correct, yeah. And it sounded like there's certain provinces that are more Christian and other provinces that have different religions that dominate each province.
Well, generally, so Christianity is less than 2% of our 1.4 billion population. So across the board, it's Hinduism about 80%, and then about 14% Islam. I think we're the third largest Islamic nation, I mean, in terms of population in the world. And then Christianity is less than 2%. But when the missionaries in the 1700s, William Carey and all of those people, when they came in to evangelize, a lot of them came to southern India. So there's a lot more percentage of Christians in southern India than than there are in northern India.
Interesting. And so was your province of Chennai one of those places that was touched?
There's a lot of legacy in terms of missionaries. Like I went to a school that was founded by missionaries. My college was founded by missionaries. I was born in a hospital that was founded by missionaries. My mother worked in a hospital that was founded by missionaries. So there's this legacy, a living legacy of what these missionaries left behind in my city.
Wow. And so what missionaries were these? Because I know that there were, a lot of Catholics came over, Protestants. I don't know about what their backgrounds were. What do you find was the influence of the Christianity? Was it of one denomination in particular?
Well, not necessarily. I think what was interesting is based on where or which part of India was colonized by which country. So you have we have some Danish influences in our state. So we've got some German and Danish missionaries in our state. We've got some English and Scottish missionaries. So it's not just one denomination per se, but more so like who colonized that particular part of India. And then, we've got a wide variety of, Methodist and Anglican and, so we have everything. So I think overall, in the 1700s, 1800s, there was a lot of missionary zeal in the church, which kind of mobilized a lot of missionaries from across denominations, and that's reflected in India as well.
So are Westerners looked at in a certain way because of that? Because you mentioned colonization. So Christianity, I would assume, especially by Hindus or Muslims, would be viewed as a Western import. Am I right in saying that?
You're totally right. And that's one of the biggest impediments to even evangelization, because Christianity is a Western religion, and then you look back into our history of some of the atrocities that were done from a political standpoint. It was not necessarily these missionaries, but there was a political entity of Britain or Denmark or whatever, Spain, Portugal, and just some of the things that they did is all often conflated with Christianity as well, and it's looked down upon. And it kind of extends. People in India obviously think that the United States is a Christian nation. So even now, that's conflated. So they look at Hollywood and some of the movies that come out, and they go, how can a Christian nation have media that's so, for lack of a better word, depraved? So these are not, so there's just a lot of this influence of your stereotypes of oh, this is a Christian nation, they did that. That still has a bearing on at the ground level of how even evangelization happens. But I have to say this, if we were to talk to Christians in India, I think they would really have a favorable view of missionaries, because a lot of these missionaries, we're talking about 1800s, where even now there are parts of India that are remote, inaccessible. It takes a lot of sacrifice. And now you put that 150, 200 years back, these missionaries coming just because they wanted the country to be evangelized. A lot of Indian Christians view that with, they're really appreciative of the sacrifices that these missionaries have made. So it's a mixed bag. A lot of times we tend to throw everything you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Oh, colonization is bad. And of course it was. But there was some good out of it in terms of these missionaries and what they left behind. So I think my family, I'm the fifth generation Christian. So going back down, it was a missionary who evangelized and changed the trajectory of our family. We're walking with God. So, yeah.
So you grew up as a pastor's kid, right?
I did.
And so, you hear a lot of things about pastors' kids. I'm assuming you were one of the better ones. But, they're either terrible or very devout. It seems to be that way. Was your view of Christianity ever like a duty just to kind of make your family proud, do you think? Or was it very genuine from a young age? Like, how was your experience growing up like that?
That's a great question. So I really have fond memories of my childhood and being a pastor's kid. And I think that's what has kind of impelled me to be doing what I'm doing, serving God in ministry. My parents, I just saw firsthand just the kind of sacrifices that they made and just the fervor and the zeal that they had for God. And their lives were just about God. And it was really amazing to see that and just to carry on that legacy. So I had a really great experience. And I think I had a great community of people around us as well. I mean, obviously, there's the negative of being a pastor's kid is that you're always in the limelight. So you got to be careful how you behave and stuff like that. But I think the biggest thing for me was, when I was 9 years old, I had a terminal kidney illness. I was in the hospital for 3 months, and the doctors sent me home. They were like, "We can't do anything with you. You've got a week to live." And God healed me. So that experience kind of has been the anchor of my faith where, I mean, like, you know what? God could have taken my life. He doesn't owe me anything. I could have died that very night. But, I have a second lease of life, so I wanted to live for him. So that kind of framed my childhood as well. So it was, I think I was fortunate to take my faith a lot more seriously at a young age because of the experience of being near death more so.
Was there anything in particular? I mean, I'm assuming everyone was praying for you. Was it just the prayers of many? Were elders laying their hands on you? What happened in that process of healing?
So, my mom, she's a pediatrician. She's a medical doctor. And I remember her coming in, I was in the hospital for about 3 months. And, the worst thing about that hospital stay was I couldn't eat sugar or salt for 3 months. So imagine not having that in your diet. It was brutal. And I remember her coming in and she was like in tears. And my mom never cries. She's the strong doctor who's got it all together. And that was when I knew there was something really wrong with me. And so, a few weeks later, they kind of sent me home. This is hospice care. You just just give him whatever he wants. I remember like the first thing they asked was like, "Hey, what do you want to do?" I said, "I want an ice cream," because it's been 3 months since I had any sugar. And my uncle took me to get an ice cream. And then obviously my body rejected it. So I vomit all over his nice car. And he's like, "Oh, it's okay. It's okay." He's trying to console me. But that very night, my condition deteriorated. So they had to kind of like take me to the hospital again because I was slipping into coma and, and my parents at that time, they really prayed and asked God and I said, "God, we give him back to you. I mean, we're stewards of your kids. I mean, if it's your will that he survives, you can have him. You can have him for ministry." And that was a prayer that they prayed. And I was, in a week's time, I think my body just started responding to medications, which it didn't before. It's the same medications. And I was home, in a week's time. And I also, the funny thing was, the doctor said that my organs had taken such a toll that I would maybe live to be 16 years old. That was like the lifespan that they had given. And I'm double that now. And my body's fine. So God's definitely healed me.
Wow. That's amazing. So it's like, what was it? Hannah, right?
Oh, yeah. Hannah.
Yeah.
And Samuel.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah. Yeah.
A miraculous intervention of God.
Well, like, if you give me a child, right, then he's devoted to your service. That's what came to mind.
No, that's true.
I think my mom told me something similar. Like there was a problem with her pregnancy with me or something, and she did something similar. But yeah, that's amazing. So they probably, you would have been old enough to know about that. So did they tell you about that prayer at the time? Or?
Oh, they did, and I obviously don't remember that prayer because I was slipping in and out of coma, but I distinctly remember the experiences. The hospital room that I lived in for 3 years, it's still etched in my memory, and just the ordeal that went with it, and it's in some ways been an anchor to my faith, knowing that, these were some of the best doctors. My mom was a pediatrician, and she had access to some of the best doctors, not just in India. These were like acclaimed doctors in Asia, and for them to say we can't do anything about it, is sometimes hard to fathom. Science is an awesome thing. I mean, but you come to a point where like this is the end of it. I mean, like we can't do anything more, and then you just need a supernatural intervention, and that's been an anchor of my faith where God's given me a new lease of life to live for.
Do you have any siblings?
I do have a younger brother.
And what's he doing?
Well, he's the production director of a church at a church in Midland, Texas.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yep.
So he's stateside.
He's stateside as well. He went to Liberty University, did his bachelor's in audio production, and now he's working for a church.
Very cool. He can help me out.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
So going back to you being a pastor's kid, did you and your brother, you said he's younger, right?
He's younger.
Were you both pretty much okay with that growing up? Like you kind of responded well to that? I mean, especially since it seems like at a young age you had this very powerful experience and it really strengthened your faith. So it was pretty much not something you had to think about too much?
Yep. I think my brother's journey was a little different, though. In our culture, we tend to emphasize academics and, STEM professions and stuff like that. And particularly those gifted in the arts, music, and, and the like. They're always told to do well in academics as well. So my brother did not have necessarily the best upbringing, even in a church setting, because, he was often compared to me, and I was good in the academics and all the boilerplate stuff of being a good kid. That was me. So my brother did have some difficulties in regards to that. So he kind of took the long route. He was never away from God per se. He's what you would, like you mentioned, I think he had to fake it sometimes in terms of his faith. But God's taken him on a journey, and he's doing really well. He's walking with God as well, and able to even reflect on his past and just how faithful God's been in his life too.
So was it at that age that you realized, because you were saved, that you were going to go into full-time ministry as a pastor, or what was your thought growing up after 9 years old?
Well, so I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. Planes are my first love. So I wanted to do something in regards to planes, maybe work for Boeing. That was one of my dreams. But, in my teens, I was 13, 14 years old, where in India, like in your 10th grade, you kind of had to decide what you wanted to do. You have an exam coming up. And, if you wanted to be a doctor, you got to get a score. If you wanted to be an engineer, so it was almost critical to decide what you wanted to do. And at that point, I really felt that, God had given me a new lease of life, and it would not be right for me to go and live as I want to live, but more so be able to speak to the goodness of God and let people know about Him. So I kind of felt that was when I was like, you know what? I want to be in ministry too. I want to teach the Bible. I want to teach about God. So I kind of, I was 14 years old then, and I kind of decided that I wanted to be in ministry after I graduated from college.
So what was the path from knowing what you wanted to do? Because I met you when you were already a grad student, right? Yep. So you had already gone to some Bible school over there, or what was the path there?
Well, my undergraduate was actually in English literature. And,
right. Yeah, I forgot about that.
And the reason why I did that was I just wanted I wanted to have a good foundation in English, and just there's a lot of overlap between the Bible as well as literature, and this was a lot of British literature. We did a little bit of American literature as well, so just trying to understand just the nuances in terms of how we process, how we reflect and think about life and living. It's almost close to even philosophy, but it's not quite philosophy.
Yeah.
So I wanted to do that, get a good grounding, get a good base, and then move into theological education. So
that's really interesting. I've never really heard that before.
Yeah.
How do you feel like? Do you feel like you've carried that with you at all, to where you still value literature in your mind and in your ability to be able to relate to other people, or?
Well, I haven't done justice to it as much as I would like to, but I think some of the skills that I picked up from that with writing papers and just, building arguments and stuff come in handy even now as I've sermon prep. And then now and again, sometimes I'm like, oh man, I read this poem a long time ago, and then I would go into my notes, try to like make some connections and stuff like that. So it's been helpful. But this is something that's been on my plate to kind of like make it to go back to a lot of my notes and really, because there's a lot of overlap. I mean, a lot of these poets, particularly in British literature, they're writing on Christian themes. I mean, they were Christians themselves. Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, John Milton. That's something that we went to a lot. So there's so much overlap that we can glean a lot from that.
Yeah. I've heard that literature, like novels and stories, really help humans with empathy versus nonfiction, which is, I'll be honest, I gravitate towards nonfiction. I like biographies and, just books on spiritual life or just books on whatever, interest in different topics. But I never really regret it when I read a novel. It's just harder for me to get into it. And the other thing is, I know when I start it, normally I'm going to finish it. So it's kind of a commitment.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how I remember I used to hear people talk about the importance of story and stuff growing up. And I was just like, it just sounded so boring. I was like, who cares? You know what I mean? But I mean, if I look at what I was interested in, I loved film, I love stories. I like songs that were ballads that had a story element to them.
Yeah.
And I loved hearing about stories of Christians in the past, like Hudson Taylor, George Mueller, Adoniram Judson, like these types of people. And so I feel like we learn a lot from people's stories, but also from stories in general. Yeah. Being able to tell someone a story is a really useful skill.
Yep.
Do you feel like that has something to do with how you frame your messages, or how is that?
I think you're spot on. I mean, even if you look at even Jesus, just how captivating, using parables and stories to be able to do that. And what's interesting is, obviously, I went to Moody, trained in exegetical preaching, love it, big idea preaching. That's what I do, but invariably, when someone comes and talks to me like 8 months later, and there's a spiritual truth that they're talking about that's related to one of my messages, it's through that, oh, remember the story that you shared? And then they would bring up that story and then talk about the spiritual truth that was related to that story. I mean, so, I would come up with these great statements and restatements of my main points of my sermon. That's not what people remember. I mean, they just remember the story and then like the spiritual principle that's like applied to that. And so that's one of the things that I've tried to really lean into. And obviously being from a different culture, being from India, my upbringing is really different, so just even using that as a segue, as a way to kind of like get them interested so I can give them a spiritual truth has been something that's been very key in my preaching here in the United States.
Are there any stories in particular that you feel like stand out that you like to share with people or stand out for you?
There are a lot of stories. Yesterday I shared in in my sermon about how me and water don't get along. We have a love-hate relationship because, growing up in a city of 8 million people in India, we didn't have access to swimming pools. It was the elite that had access to it, so I never knew how to swim. But now I'm married into a family where my wife is an excellent swimmer. Her parents are acclaimed swimmers. So I've had to kind of like deal with that. We would go on a walk on Lake Michigan when my wife's like, oh, I want to go for a swim. Do you want to join me? And I was like, no, I'm not doing that. So I shared the story of how we were on a cruise and we went snorkeling and she wanted me to snorkel. And I go, Katie, my wife, I don't even swim. I can't snorkel. So we went through this whole process where there was this lifeguard training me how to snorkel and I'm bumbling and all of that. And it was just so hard for me to let go, and even follow his instructions. He goes, just go down, just let go, just be free. Don't, just simple stuff. It's so hard for me to do because I want control, and But then when I did listen to him, we were able to kind of explore the coral reefs, and just see the colorful fish and stuff that I would only see on TV. And so the spiritual principle that I was trying to share was like, a lot of times in our life, God has something better, much more than what we can imagine for our lives, but we don't want to let go. We don't want to, we just want to hold on to stuff. And we're like kicking and struggling, gasping for air like I was while being told how to snorkel, and then the moment I did let go, I was able to experience the delights of those coral reefs. And that's something that God wants us to give ourselves to him so he can lead us as opposed to how leading our lives. So, yep.
So kind of story by way of illustration through kind of personal examples.
Yes, you're right. Yep.
Interesting. And how do you enjoy preaching? Is it something that comes natural to you? Do you like writing sermons? Do you like preaching?
I know preaching is hard.
It's hard.
I mean, just particularly like now I preach way more regularly. So it's like almost like if you were to preach once in 2 months, you have a lot of material because you're reading, you're in your Bible and stuff. But then when it's weekly, that's a whole different ball game because you got to be fresh and you got to do, your own devotional reading, but at the same time, think of like what you're doing on Sundays and stuff like that. And it's so the process of preaching, just prepping for a sermon is very hard. It's almost like, you're laboring for something, from the text. You're trying to be faithful to the text, do as much exegesis as possible, go into the languages, try to determine like what's the author trying to convey and stuff like that. So it's hard. I love it though. But just standing in front of people, that's hard too. Naturally I'm an introvert. So just going up there and expending 40 minutes of energy is something that's, drains me a little bit. Sunday evenings and Mondays are actually hard for me because I can still physically feel the pain of all the energy that I've exerted. But I know like when I stand there and I'm preaching, I know this is exactly what I was called to do. There's just so much peace, despite it all. And I really love the opportunity to be able to lead people in God's truth and telling people about God and just how awesome he is. And that's something that I just don't take for granted at all,
I feel like after I became a lot more serious about my faith, I really enjoyed listening to sermons just as like a pastime. Some people read books, watch movies. My thing was just like I loved just listening to preachers. And was that ever the case for you, or were you modeling your preaching after people you actually knew, or what's your history of taking in preaching for yourself?
So I used to listen to a lot of sermons before, but now with having 2 kids, I don't have a lot of free time to be able to do that. But I do love, one of the things that I love to do is to listen to Christian radio, so that's something that I do everywhere I drive. I live in Chicago, wherever I go, I'm listening to Moody Radio and just some of the preaching that's there. And that's been sort of my go-to now, where that's how I soak in a lot of the preaching. And obviously, I go up and if there's any specific YouTube video, shorts or something like that in regards to preaching, I'm always listening to it,
What was your father like as a preacher?
My father, he was a great preacher. I mean, he was very charismatic in his presentation. He was, a lot of preachers in our country aren't trained per se. I mean, pastors aren't like, there's not a lot of access to the Bible colleges in India where that's the route you go to. So if you feel you're called, you're just under a mentor and then you preach. I think my dad was one of those guys who really from the start was very particular about making sure that what he preached was faithful to God's word and it was like the right proper exegesis and stuff like that. Rightly dividing the word of truth, that was his motto. That's from 2 Timothy, and that's something that he kind of really drilled into our heads to be faithful to the text, and I really appreciate him for that.
Do you feel what was the initial? Because you said you're taking a break right now, but you were pursuing a PhD in intercultural studies. So what was the mindset behind that?
So I went to Moody, did a lot of systematic and biblical theology. I just did a little bit of theology even at Trinity. And then I felt like I did have the tools that were needed to exegete the text. But a lot of what pastors and teachers do is they just exegete people and culture as well. I mean, you live in a city like Chicago that's so multicultural. Like our church has about 20 languages that's spoken even for a mid-sized congregation. So you have people from different cultures. So I really wanted to learn about cultures and how the gospel and Christianity is expressed through culture, And so that's what my PhD in intercultural studies is about, just learning what goes into how you contextualize the gospel truth for different cultures and just learning about missions. A lot of the, some of the names that you even mentioned, Hudson Taylor, some of these missionaries, just learning about that. Yeah. And I still have a long way to go, but I'm very excited about it. Yeah.
What are like some key insights that you've learned from either your study of it or even your interactions interculturally with people from your congregation? What are some of the things that you've discovered that are necessary and maybe helpful knowing if you're going into ministry with many different cultures present?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is in regards to culture, we don't actually take time to think through how much it affects the way we live out our life, where let's say you take a scripture like be hospitable to everyone. I mean, hospitality is the concept. The way it plays out is so different in different cultures. I mean, in India, hospitality is you just showered with so much hospitality that you're like, oh, can you please stop? That's how you would feel. Whereas in the United States, I mean, if you schedule a dinner for 3 weeks down the line, that's hospitality. So well, we don't often think about it. So especially when there's a confluence of cultures, people can get offended. If an Indian, comes in and then wants to have dinner and then there's something that's scheduled for 2 months down the line, they get hurt about it. And now when you're in that culture and you're like crossing cultures, it really is important that we understand how it plays out in terms of how they even would interpret our behavior and what we think is normative or just how things are done, and I think that's something that is very important. And just with how the world is going now with the globalization and just access, 20 years ago it was very different. I think now people are a lot more sensitive to stuff like this. But I think for me, the biggest thing is there's just so much we can learn. I mean, there's a lot of good in cultures, but there's a lot of sin in culture too. I mean, the way we live out and just looking at another culture kind of like exposes the blind spots that we have and kind of reflect a Christianity that is more biblical, in aspects where our culture might not be biblical. So that's something that, I love exploring, and I really want to dig more into it as well.
Well, I think you hit it on the head by saying, what we mean by hospitality. And I've heard in certain churches, there can be like an apologizing for taking people's time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, that's weird. You know what I mean? Because it's like, I've always been a fan of kind of taking our time as a church. I mean, if the sermon goes over, it goes over. The hard thing is when like my church has like multiple services so you can't really do that. But I think like my experience of suburban church where I'm at, generally speaking, like we do have community. I think it's better than most, but there's still this sense of like, oh, it's time to get back to my life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, this was great. Yeah. Good to see you, but gotta go, have stuff to do. And I think what you were talking about earlier about not having 911.
Yep.
It's almost like you guys need each other in a way we don't need each other. You know?
Right.
And when you don't need each other, that's obviously going to make you more isolated.
Yep.
Because now it's about my family, my house, my property, and my time.
Yep.
Right? But when you are in a place that isn't as affluent and you don't have all the same privileges or expedience of getting care for yourself, you need each other.
Yeah.
So it's going to create community by necessity. So how do you do that when you don't need it is the question.
Well, that's been one of my yearnings and also, prayer for our church here in the United States. I mean, there's something to community. It's almost the paradox of life. I mean, when we want, it's even Jesus talks about it. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but then whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. There's that paradox. I mean, there's something to it when you have an outward posture where you're like giving yourself away and just the fulfillment that it brings. I mean, my wife and I were at the stage where we just have really young kids. My daughter's 4, my son's about 16 months. There's so much of like giving right now. And sometimes it's hard, but there's just this satisfaction that comes from giving that we are innately wired for. And I think our churches in the United States kind of undercut that process. And I feel like the way the culture is we don't do that enough. I mean, and sadly, so there's so much isolation, loneliness, depression, where we have an antidote right here in just transcending what we're going through and giving of your time away. And that's one of the things that, I haven't skinned that, so I don't have an answer for you as to how we could be better at it, but I would really hope we as, our churches here, the church that I pastor as well, we really become family so that it's not like, oh, I gotta leave because I have a Bears game to go to, but more so like, hey, you know what, this is my family as well. Maybe I can watch the game on my phone for about 5 minutes while I'm with my family as opposed to just going in my couch and watching. So just building those rhythms where we could just experience community together, I think is probably one of the most important things that we as a church can work towards here in the United States.
Yeah, I think there's a sense of, I finally get to do what I want to do. You know what I mean? When we get our days off and our time off and stuff like that. And I've had those moments where it's like, there are opportunities to have community at church and things that I probably should have done, but I chose not to.
Yeah.
Because, I don't want to do anything right now. And then the irony is, when you start giving more, you actually feel richer, in a sense. And when you start pouring your time out for others, you actually get more energy.
Yep.
We all need rest, but at the same time, like when I look at the metaphors and analogies that Jesus gives us, he says, out of your heart will flow rivers of living water. It has this sense of endlessness to it.
Yep.
It's not like, I have 2 gallons of water and I already gave some to you, so that's too much. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And in Scripture, I don't see that. It's like if you are filled with the Spirit, it's supposed to be overflowing. Yep. And I actually had one of my pastor friends say, there was a saint back in the 1200s or 1300s who said, we have too many canals and not enough reservoirs, meaning we have a lot of people who the second they get any water, they pour it out immediately and they're empty.
Yeah.
But we need more people who are actually full, like a reservoir, and the water flows over because they're so full.
Yep.
They're not just immediately dishing out the first thing they got from God. And I think part of that equation is also really abiding in Christ for certain periods of time. I mean, if you look at Jesus, we don't really know what he did for most of his life until he was 30.
Yeah.
And I mean, if that was true of him, like how much more of us? Like,
and even his rhythms, you could see him go to a solitary place, and people are trying to find him because he's getting his fill from his relationship with the Father.
Yeah, it was very extreme in both directions. Like in one sense, we would be like, I would never like isolate myself because people might need me, but he didn't seem to feel that way. He wasn't worried about that.
Yeah.
He's like, no, I know I need this and I need to do this. This is part of me being a human. This is part of me communicating with my Father. And then the other side of it is we're like, oh my gosh, and I also could never do that much. It's just like people never left him alone.
Yeah.
But he had both extremes.
Yeah.
Or like he withdrew for extreme solitude and then he was like pouring himself out completely. Yeah. So almost like he rested more than we rest, and he also poured out more than we pour out.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think, and you hit the nail on the head when you used the word abiding. I mean, I think that's the secret to our Christian life. A lot of times we just feel the way we are wired as individuals is we want to take control, we want to exert effort, we want to strive and all what God's asking. And we want to be focused on the fruit too, because we want to see fruit, and God's saying, well, abide in me and I in you, and you will bear much fruit. So the goal is not fruit, but more so abiding is the goal, and then fruit is the outworking of that. And I think we as a culture can really grow in that, because busyness, hurry, restlessness, that kind of seems to encapsulate what we're about as well, and what I'm about. My life is like that. We've got kids to take to school, take care of them. There's work, there's marriage, there's friendships, there's sports. There's just so many things that are competing for our times, and it's just hard to rest and abide. But I think coming to the heart of it, I think when we give stuff away, there's just a lot of fulfillment to it. One of the things that I say, not in a disparaging sense, but again, hear my heart for this. I believe God has me here in the United States. I love this country. I love the culture. I love what God's doing here. But I think, sometimes I feel that what we give to God is our excess. Be it our time, be it our money, be it our resource, be it our volunteering. We just make sure that our families take everything, is an excess. And then just traveling to different parts of the world, particularly in the context of like missions, and just seeing people who don't have stuff, but they give, willingly all that they have, and it's, I've been in houses where they feed us this huge meal, which we don't even, this is too much, I can't have it. But then that would have been like their, 2 weeks worth of their groceries, because that's how poor they are. But they want to give that away. And just the happiness in their face of like them doing that is just, it's hard to even explain just the joy and satisfaction that they get. And I really want us to be able to experience that same kind of joy. One of the funny things, I've known a lot of people who've gone on mission trips. We've done mission trips myself. My wife's done a few even without me to India. And the first thing that they would say is, oh, they're just so happy, even though that they have so little. And we stopped there. My next question is, so what do we do now? How do we change our life and our systems so we have maybe some of the happiness that they derive, from not having much, but just being content with, giving, and maybe there's something to it that would really help us the way we live out our lives, maybe our loneliness, depression, our mental health, and God could change that.
Are there any of those lessons that you have kind of applied to your own life and ministry here that you've decided to go against the grain a little bit?
Well, that's one of the things. That's a great question, and when my wife is from Michigan, she's from here. Even in our marriage, is one of the things that we felt was our ethos, where we're going to look at the good in both of our cultures and try to have a marriage, try to build a family that integrates both of those cultures. So one of the things that we believe in is having an open door at home. We might have our plans, but if someone shows up, there's a need. We want to encourage that. In fact, my 4-year-old daughter, we went to India this past February. She was in India for about a month and a half. I was just there for a couple of weeks. And then she saw how there would just be guests streaming in every day, because that's just how they live life. And then we come to the United States, and day two, like, she's asking, who's visiting us today? So, and I would love that. We don't have a lot of visitors, but just even just integrating that into our ethos, so it's not a weird thing where, like, if someone wants to come, we're like, no, there might be days we're not available, so we can't go to that extreme where, like, you can come whenever, but just trying to find a middle ground where, we can practice some of these things that other cultures do better.
Yeah. I think also that's changed over time. I think it used to be better in this country. I don't think it was ever as good in that sense, the hospitality, as in the Middle East or in India or in certain places. But I do think, at least, my grandma would tell me her mom would cook a pie, and like you would just cook because you're expecting someone to drop in. There was nothing in
Yeah.
particular that day, but they would just cook food because someone might come in and then you'll have something to give them.
Yep.
Almost now it's like, oh, you're presumptuous if
Yep.
you come over to my house and you didn't tell me.
Yeah.
Back then it was like, oh, thanks for coming by, you know? And so I think that may have something to do with technology and some other things that we've kind of let run our lives, because even in our culture here in the West, it's changed a lot in the last 100 years.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. You know, my grandmother, she just recently went to be with the Lord, and that's what she would do. I mean, particularly Sundays, she's cooking for 20 people because there's a bunch of people from church coming home, you know, and having food with us. But, you know, I'm really hopeful for the future, though. I mean, just I think we're at a spot where you can't be a cultural Christian because the cost is too high. You know, in a lot of countries, like in India, India, I think the persecution in the Open Doors report was number 11. But in a lot of countries, like you either are all in or you're all out. I mean, there's no middle ground in terms of like following God. And I think we're getting there. And that's a good place to be because you actually really stand for something. And, you know, and if you can't, I mean, you know, God has his own way of bringing you back if you're his, you know, but I'm really hopeful that a lot of these healthy habits that were even here in the United States in the past would become fashionable again, and we actually do it because there's so much benefit, you know, to it.
Yeah, it has to come from the heart, you know, and it really has to come from genuinely changed lives.
Absolutely.
And that's the only way to make it sustainable, because I think a lot of people can hear what we're talking about and be like, oh, that would be nice. I would like that. But you can't ultimately have the strength or the power to keep that up unless it's genuinely coming from the Holy Spirit.
Absolutely. And that's the secret to our Christian lives as well. You know, the whole point of even like the Sermon on the Mount, I mean, it's unattainable. The standard is unattainable in your own strength. And that's where God has given us the Holy Spirit as the helper, and his grace is sufficient for us to be able to do life with him. You know, and that applies to pretty much every area, you know.
Yeah. By the way, you mentioned a number, what did you say, persecution, number 11?
Number 11. India was number 11 last year for persecution, and, you know, it was the Open Doors Watch report.
Like number 11 out of, like, away from the first country? Like, is that what it is?
Yep.
Okay.
So it's I think they just have a ranking of the most persecuted countries in the world, and India was number 11.
What was number 1?
I forget. I think it was North Korea or Iran or something like that.
That would make sense, yeah.
Yeah.
You said Iran?
Yeah, Iran was up there as well.
That's interesting, because I feel like so many Iranians that I've met are Christians or claim to be Christians. You know what I mean?
Well, I've heard, you know, the Iranian church, underground church, is one of the fastest growing churches in the world. You know, and it just goes to, you know, when Christianity is persecuted, it thrives.
Yeah, that's basically it. I think the hard thing is like the post-Christian and the secularization of the West. I don't think the U.S. is quite there yet, but, you know, Japan, I think, is the most secular country in the world.
Wow.
And then a friend from church actually ended up going there as a missionary. But those are very difficult contexts to be a missionary in, because it's more like people are just apathetic.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of what we fight in this country, witnessing. Because I was talking to someone recently, and it's like, oh, you know, you have to share the good news. I'm like, yeah, but they don't even know there's bad news. You know, they don't care.
Yeah.
It's like, because so many testimonies I've heard are like, you know, God's love finally came alive in my heart. And you could tell someone about the love of Christ who's feels like their life's going quite well. And they'd be like, that's nice. But I don't think I need that. That's good for you, though.
Yeah.
That you found something that works for you, but there's no reality to it for them.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
You're right. And I think another aspect, and this is something interesting. I mean, I came to the United States 2012, and there was election season then.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I didn't even know what the word evangelical meant.
Yeah.
I thought it was, you know, someone who evangelizes, and Christians evangelize. That's what they do. But what was very interesting was just even getting acquainted to that word, getting acquainted to Christians in the United States, it was so easy to learn what they were against. Oh, we stand against this, stand against that.
Yeah.
But there was no vision of like what we are for. Like what are
Right.
what does it mean to walk with God? We just recently concluded a series on the book of Galatians where Paul says, for by faith you are sons of God. Like what is that? What does that mean? Like you're adopted into God's family. That's one of the highest honors that you could have. But that's never been emphasized much in public square. So everything that people know of evangelicals and Christians are the negative,
Yeah.
And so obviously now we've created a culture where there's pushback to that because obviously they're fighting against injustice, that supposedly Christians are doing, and I really, and rightly so. A lot of the issues that Christians are against, it's right. It's the word of God. When the word of God says, if something is sin, it is sin. But I feel like there's a way in which where we could really, extol the blessing, the delight of walking with God while standing for sin as opposed to just having one or the other, so.
Well, and I think that comes back to what kind of before we started recording I was talking about is like, probably everyone, whether you are doing really well in your Christian walk right now or not doing that well, you still feel like, there's more to this life as a believer. And we've been going through Acts and my Bible study for, I think, 2 years maybe.
Wow.
And so, but every week, the stuff that we're reading about, I'm like, I have to be honest with myself. This isn't common.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I understand that was a particular time and place, but I don't think we're called to be any less than what we're reading here.
Yep.
Or in the epistles and stuff like this. Now, not to say that they were perfect, and there were a lot of issues with the early church. I don't want to idealize that.
Yeah.
But I do want to say that there's a lot of things there to aspire to. Yeah. And when they're going off track, they're being harshly rebuked, to get back. Yeah. And so I guess what I'm trying to say with that is the things that they're focusing on. Here was an interesting one. I think I actually heard this. I was visiting my friend's church yesterday, and in the sermon, Ephesians closes with a prayer, talking about pray for me for boldness and this and that. And the boldness in declaring the gospel, and because he was in chains, he said at that point. And he's like, he didn't ask for them to pray for release. Yeah. He was in prison. Yeah. And he didn't go on about that, but it made me think about it of like, that would be the first thing our Bible study would pray for. The first thing we'd pray for is he'd be released.
Yeah.
Because he was in chains for the gospel. So his focus was the gospel. I think that's like a bonus for us. Like, oh, you're a Christian and you share the gospel? That's awesome.
Yeah.
What a nice bonus. Yeah. Whereas like, it's not like we're expecting it.
Yep.
And I had a friend who was sick in the hospital, and he had this weird infection. He didn't know why, and he had to go back to the hospital multiple times. And his outset had changed at that point in his life, where instead of asking for him to be delivered from the sickness, he's like, who am I supposed to witness in this hospital that I keep coming back here? What a different mindset, right?
Wow, that's amazing.
And so, but that's kind of having the mindset of everything is meant for a reason, and God has me where he has me. It doesn't mean we can't ask for stuff. Of course we can.
Yep.
But that's not the first thing on Paul's mind, when he's asking for prayer. And so I just think that we can learn a lot for what we see there in the epistles of like, what is he asking for prayer
Absolutely.
for? What's he praying for them for?
Yeah.
They have a famine. Didn't pray for the famine. They did bring money from other churches.
Yeah.
But his prayers for them are so specific, and they normally have to do with their life being enriched spiritually, is what I see. Yep. And most of our prayers, at least most of the prayers I feel like that I'm surrounded by, aren't guided to that singular purpose.
I think you're totally right. The thing about our Christian life is that I think our foremost identity, our foremost relationship becomes our relationship with God and how we relate to him and all of that. And a lot of times our reality is not that case, I remember I did an assignment where in school where I had to go to like a couple of immigrant churches and try to find the difference between what are some differences between first generation immigrant churches. So these are churches in Chicago where these are first generation immigrants who are not as proficient in the English language. So this church service is in their own native tongue. And so what are some of the differences? So I went to a Polish church. I went to a Korean church. I think it was also a Hispanic church as well. And it was so interesting that there were so many themes of Jesus coming back again emphasized in those churches. And like, I think to even my church and even the sermons that I preach, I'm like, when was the last time I'm talking about Jesus coming back? And I think there's a reason for that. I mean, a lot of these immigrants who don't feel at home are longing, are yearning for Jesus to come back so that they could finally feel at home, whereas we're just so satisfied where we are. I mean, we want the good life now.
Yeah, we are at home. A lot
we
of
are
us.
at home. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we can cultivate where, and maybe that's the way we could pray prayers where it might not be relief in the present, where you talked about Paul's chains or how we pray in terms of, some of the illnesses, suffering that we go through. Maybe just having that eternal mindset where we know like God has us here for a time, and we're here to expand the kingdom of God and take as many people as we can in God's strength along with us to heaven. And maybe that changes perspective in terms of how we pray those prayers as well.
I've always had that feeling ever since I really started taking my faith seriously. I think I feel very at home with stories like Pilgrim's Progress, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. There's this sense of I'm just like passing through.
A pilgrim, a sojourner.
Yeah. Which is where I got the name for this thing, is Wayfaring Stranger. Because, and we sung that song when we were in choir, right?
Yeah, I think
that
so.
That was one of our songs, I'm pretty sure. And that's actually was my introduction to it. But it's this idea of this world is not my home that has become a fringe idea.
Yep.
And I think all the discrepancies we see between where you're from and where you're at now have a lot to do with that. And I mean, it makes sense, right? If things are going well for you, aren't you going to be tempted to set up shop, right? That's the other thing that I find interesting. I don't even know if this fully relates, but it just made me think of like when the transfiguration happens and Peter's like, why don't we build some tents? You know what I mean? Why don't we just stay here?
Yeah.
And I think even spiritually, sometimes God can really show us some really cool things, but we shouldn't camp there. I think Oswald Chambers in My Utmost for His Highest has something about that where he's like, that's the temptation. It's like God showed us something. He met us somewhere and we're like, I just want to stay here.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, you have to keep going.
Yeah.
That's good. Remember this. Remember what I did for you. Remember that moment we had together, but don't try to replicate it. You know what I mean? Don't try to just relive the same day over and over again.
Yep.
And I think that idea of the manna, of it being fresh every day, and if you try to keep it, it's not going to work. It's going to spoil.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good metaphor for our spiritual existence with God is we can't live on what he did with us yesterday.
Yep.
We have to seek him today.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And the most awesome thing about God is his mercies are new every morning. And you can experience that every day. And that's what God wants to do with us,
Yeah, my pastor says he expects to hear from God every day. And for a lot of people, that sounds very radical. Like, what are you, charismatic? Or what are you like, you're just hearing stuff, or you're just trying to make up these experiences? It's like, no, I think as you grow in maturity, I mean, you just expect more from God because you've seen what he's done for you in the past. What role does prayer in your life play in your ministry as a pastor?
Well, I think it's one of the most important things. I remember the story of Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers, and while his church was exploding and people wanted to know the secret of what's going on, he takes them to the boiler room where there's like a bunch of people praying, and he goes, this is the secret. I mean, this prayer is what it is. It's probably the most important thing that I could do, even for my people in church. I mean, even just yesterday, yesterday was a Sunday. I spoke to a lot of people, and there's just so many needs. And a lot of times we are even helpless. Even if I do want to help them, I can. But the only way that I can help them is through prayer. And there's been no revival, no great movements of faith that have happened without prayer. And prayer is just simply talking to God and just, building that relationship, communing with Him. And that's the most important thing that I could do for my audience. I mean, for my church people, is to support them in prayer.
Do you prefer to pray? I mean, most people, it seems like, prefer to pray in the morning before they go to bed. What does your prayer life look like?
Well, obviously, it's the first thing that I do, when I wake up, pray. Also growing in a Christian home, you have these rhythms of prayer, before food, and which sometimes can become routine more than actually for what it is. So that's something that we're trying to even cultivate with our kids, try to make it fun. So, my daughter has a song that is a prayer, so she sings that song. But one of the things that, that I want to do is to kind of cultivate a rhythm of prayer where it's conversation with God all the time. Like when I'm driving in the car, even today when I was driving, there were a few things that were in my mind, and I was praying, and I was just talking to God about it. And that's something that I really want to even model, not just for me, but I want my kids to see that my relationship with God is something that's alive, and it's active, and it's real to me, so that, whenever, not just in moments of pain or need, but even in terms of adoration and just thanking God, this is the vehicle to prayer, is the vehicle to do that. And I really, anyone you ask, they'd say, I want to have a better prayer life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And that's what I want as well.
Yeah. What have you learned about God's character through being a father?
Oh, I mean, a lot. And one of the biggest things is I did not think, I'm generally not a patient guy. I get annoyed pretty quickly. I need my space. It's just hard. And I couldn't imagine, when we had our first daughter, and just the amount of patience that we've had, and just saying, for example, just training her to say thank you. I would have had to say that statement. Well, what do you say? You say thank you about 1,000 times, then she still doesn't get it, but I still love her. I mean, and I kind of think of our relationship with God. I mean, a lot of times we think of God as this person who's up there, and is trying to get us and is not patient with us. And so we got to act a certain way. Imagine the amount of compassion if I, as a father, can have on my own daughter, how much God can have for us. So that, in a sense, was revolutionary in how I related to God. And the other biggest thing was also, a lot of times I feel like we're so hard on ourselves, where, where we just want to be at a certain level of we're talking about our prayer life. We got to be at a certain level. So when we're not, we're just too hard on ourselves. But then I look at the process of my kid. A 1-day-old kid, I'm not expecting her to walk, not expecting her to run. And then you go on after 6 months, they start to 3 months, they turn over. And that's a big thing. We're celebrating, we're cheering. I'm telling my friends that my wife and I were happy. And then she starts to crawl, and it's the biggest event in our lives, where we celebrate that. And then she starts to walk and then run. And it's all of these moments are moments of celebration, high points in our life. And I think to God and how He must feel about us, even just the small steps that we take, which we might think is insignificant. Others certainly do think it's insignificant. It doesn't matter to them. But how much God rejoices in that one step of obedience or faith that we take, in moving towards Him. And that was something that I didn't think, I've never saw it that way until I had a kid, and I was just experiencing those small moments with them.
What about what has being a husband changed in your understanding of God?
The biggest thing, I think, for me coming in, my wife and I were from 2 different cultures. And so one of the things that we decided on was was we're going to have an open communication because we're going to do things that's weird. I mean, from a cultural standpoint, and just to have that relationship where we could like talk through stuff and like, why did you react that way or do something, and just, iron sharpening iron. My wife loves to read my sermons. So she goes through a couple of iterations of my sermons before I like preach on Sunday. And just like the refining process of that has been great. I mean, kind of like, your question was in terms of how that reflects on God. And I think the biggest thing is like sanctification, just the process of safety and security that even a relationship, marriage brings to work on your sanctification is reflective of like how God even like has this covenant with us where he's like working together, with us. And that's something that I really appreciate about my wife, to be able to do that,
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really cool that she can help you with sermons, actually. I haven't heard that too often.
Well, my wife went to seminary with me. She's taken preaching classes and stuff. So exegesis is something that's her passion as well. So even though she's got her job, she's got her internship, she always like is very curious about like what passage I'm in and helping me exegete stuff. And it's a really refining process because sometimes we would have disagreements in terms of what the passage is saying. So my first job is to be able to like convince her, hey, this is why I'm preaching this way. So it kind of like hones me and refines me before I even come on stage to be able to like, preach a particular passage.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. What is your role? Because you said you are still part of that missions organization that's based in India, right? Based in Chennai, where you're from?
Yep.
And so what is your role in that missions organization?
So we have a shared leadership model in our missions organization. So I'm one of 4 leaders, part of the main leadership team. We have I think now we have about 20 churches in different parts of India and about 35 missionaries working there. So a lot of it right now, like it's more of a consulting type stuff. I'm not as involved being in the United States in the day-to-day running of the organization, more so providing strategic leadership to the organization. And then I try to visit India at least once a year, where we have our annual conferences where all the missionaries are there, and then we fellowship with them and kind of focus on specific areas that we could grow and impact the community around us.
And so are you involved also in like the selecting of newer missionaries, or just kind of maintaining the missionaries you already have, or?
Well, so I'm more involved in terms of the strategic direction of the missions organization, and in terms of maybe I would be asked to speak at a leadership development for these missionaries, not so much, the hiring of new missionaries where, we have some of our other leaders who are in the ground close to what's going on doing that.
Where are most of the missionaries
So
located?
they're scattered, in different parts of India, about 8 states in India, we have, and some of those are even very dangerous places to be in for the gospel, at least, with just how the political climate is. So there's a lot of persecution, but God's been very faithful in helping us reach a significant number of people, and a lot of them are first-generation Christians as well, and that's awesome. I mean, people who have their families have not followed Jesus, but then here they're committing their lives to God.
Are there ways that you try to avoid making it a Western, Eastern thing? And are there precautions you take to be like, oh, we're not trying to import Western culture or stuff like that? Does that have anything to do with kind of the way that the missions organization is run?
I think the easiest thing has been to make them realize that Christianity is not a Western religion.
Right. That is the easiest thing. Although even though that's not how it comes across sometimes. But.
Yeah, and so we've had conversations in regards to that. And and the other thing that goes our way is it's believed that Apostle Thomas, made his way to India, and there's a whole group, a denomination of Christians that apparently was started because of him. And then he was actually killed in my city. So there's almost in the middle of the city, there's a small hill that's called St. Thomas Mount. That's the name of that place. And there's a church.
I've seen that, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a church up there, where it's believed he was there and his remains are there as well. So there's a lot of Indian influences where you could just point and say, you know what, this is not something, Christianity is not something that came to India in the 17th and the 18th century with the missionary movement. It predates that and it's been here, so it's not a Western religion. So, it is a hurdle to cross because it's just so easy. It's a low-hanging fruit to kind of equate Christianity with, Western society, religion, and also just colonization and stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah, because I think also there might be ways that you would know better than me, but are there ways that Christianity is westernized in the sense that, we use Western Christian styles of music or our way of talking or something like that, I don't know, as opposed to like the cultures making their own versions of everything so that it's more true to them. You know what I'm saying?
No, and you're hitting on what my PhD program is about in terms of contextualization, where you make the gospel your own in terms of the culture. And that's something that's really unique about Christianity as well, because even if you look at it from a biblical standpoint, you're going through the book of Acts 15, the whole conflict was like, oh, is Christianity a Jewish religion or can Gentiles be in the fold? I mean, or do you have to become a Jew if you're a Gentile to be a Christian?
Right.
And the answer is no. I mean, like, you can be a Christian in your own, culture. It doesn't matter. And one of the downsides of the missionary movement, and I always say, one of the fun things about our culture is how we do our weddings. We have fun. There's dancing. There's a groom comes on a horse. A groom comes on an elephant. It's just so much fun.
Right.
And you know what? I was deprived of that. Indian Christians are deprived of that because even the way we do our weddings, the songs that we sing in our weddings are so similar to how weddings are done in the UK, in the United States, because that's how the missionaries did it, So, and now people are obviously, we just laugh about it. I mean, it's not something that's a big deal, Well, I didn't write on an elephant for my wedding, but that's okay. I can live with that. But there's just so much uniqueness to each culture. There's that Christianity. It's the most diverse religion in the world. We always, here in the United States, we kind of view it negatively as not being diverse. It's almost like the white man's religion, but that's not true at all. It's the most diverse movement in the world. And you go to different places in the world, the songs that they sing, it's different.
Yeah.
And it's just such a picture of how heaven is going to be as well, where there's going to be every tongue, every tribe, every nation represented there.
So is your kind of intercultural studies and your experience in missions, is that closely related to your pastoral work in your church, or how does that tie in together?
That's a great question. So yes, missions is one of the things that's in my portfolio. My official title is executive pastor, but missions is in my portfolio as well. So our church actually has an active partnership with my organization where it's not financial, but it more so like, prayer and, just coming alongside in terms of support. And we also have, partnerships with the people in other parts of the world. Like we have an active partnership with a missionary in Burundi. A couple of our pastors go there, and we're planning a missions trip to Burundi next year as well. Hopefully I get to go there. I want to see. I've never been to Africa, so I'm really wanting to be there as well. But so to answer your question, missions is so integrated into what I do, even at my pastoral role here at 180 Chicago.
Well, is there anything that you want to touch on that we kind of haven't been able to touch on yet that's on your heart?
Well, that's a good question. I'd love to talk about just your experience here at Moody. And not necessarily Moody, but more so like just how youngsters, people our age relate to the faith and just some of and what do we do with that?
So like at our age or like when we were here?
even when we were here.
Yeah. So like, what is that, 12 years ago now?
Yeah, 12 years ago. How do we look back and go, I mean, how would we disciple
Yeah.
people like when we were there? What were some of the things that we could have done differently?
Well,
You know?
actually, I will say, I don't know about yourself, but I mean, the cool thing about, because I think, wasn't David also in the master's program when he was here?
Yeah, he
Okay.
was. He was.
And I think I felt like I knew a few people in the grad school. Do you remember Delphin?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was a cool guy.
Yeah.
I bring those people up because even though you weren't that much older than me, you were only 2 years older than me, I
Yeah.
think. Still are only 2 years older than me. But so looking back on my experience at Moody, I had a great time. I mean, everyone has their thing. I feel like can be popular to like, I feel like we can be very cynical. But my particular experience was really good. I made a lot of lifelong friends, you know,
Yep.
and people who mean a lot to me. I learned a lot of things. It was a very important time in my life. I had started taking my faith pretty seriously a year or two before that. And so coming here, you know, actually fellowshipping with a lot of people who also took it seriously. And then from professors who'd been teaching here for 20 or 30 years, a lot of them had. It was a really valuable experience to me. But I would say if I could do something different, I don't think I took advantage of my relationships with my professors as much as I wish I had.
Huh.
And so now, like for instance, I had Dr. Sauer on the podcast last week, and like I never had him as a professor. I chose a lot of my classes based on my work schedule. And so there were a lot of profs that were really well-known professors that I missed out on because I was building my life to fit into my work schedule so I could balance school and work.
Yeah.
And I think that was a mistake. I think I should have worked hard in the summers and then either worked very little or not at all during the school year. And so I could really just soak everything in. So I think taking advantage of the professors is one thing. I think also in a place like this meaning an accredited academic institution, I think we can underemphasize the importance of spiritual communities. I was never part of a church I wasn't a part of a church for the entire 3 years. I was part of a lot of different churches.
Yeah.
And I wish I would have just stuck with one.
Yeah.
You know?
And I remember us visiting a few churches together.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was fun. I mean, we probably went to Moody Church at some point together. And,
Yeah.
you know, some other ones. But so that's another thing. I think spiritual community, I wish I would have chosen that and just stuck with it. I bounced around a lot. And look, that taught me something too. I mean, I got to see a lot of churches. And then also, you and I traveled to a lot of churches. So we really got to experience like a vast array of Christianity.
Yep.
So I would say those two. And then we can also de-emphasize, like I said, community, but also prayer. I think that's why the seniors can be cynical by the time they finish, is because their mind is filled, but their heart has grown stale.
Yeah.
And so that definitely happened to me, where I would say by the end of the 3 years, I became a cynical senior in some ways that I had detested when I first got here. I shouldn't say detested, but it was very distasteful to me to see the attitude among a lot of the seniors here. And then that happened to me because I was overzealous, I wasn't disciplined, and I wasn't prayerful. I was focusing a lot on knowledge and not on my relationship with God. And I wanted things more than I wanted to listen to him. So I'd say those are the mistakes I made. And that's what I would have done differently. But that's my experience. What about yourself?
Well, I think one of the biggest thing was, you know, because I came from India and I felt this was really an obligation. You know, my parents were very sacrificial in providing to be here. I really felt that I needed to do really well in my academics, which I did. I mean, I was really good at it. But I felt like I did not invest in relationships as much as I should have. I remember, friends inviting me to, just a fellowship. And I would go like, oh, I've got an assignment to finish, so I got to focus on that. And now looking back 10 years ago, man, I just wish I had gone there, because at the end of the day, it's about friendships. It's about community. I mean, not to the not to the extent of neglecting your studies. Obviously, we got to be good stewards of what God's given us. But I really do wish I'd invested more in friends and poured my life out a lot more than I actually did. That's one of my biggest regrets, being at Moody.
Yeah, if I saw you, it was in your dorm.
Yeah.
That's the only time I ever saw you.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of like I'm an introvert. I don't hang out, and so maybe that was used as an excuse, But now, looking back 10 years, being in pastoral ministry, just engaging with a lot of people, I wish I had done that 10 years ago,
Yeah, those are the things that you realize you can't get that back.
Yep.
You know what I mean? But you can always change the way you're doing things now.
Absolutely.
And I look back on that even a little bit on my pre and after COVID. This isn't necessarily a spiritual truth, but it applies to spirituality. But I remember there were a couple events, just like fun events, concerts, things like that I skipped out on because, I have work and I don't want to ask for it off. It's just a hassle and blah, blah, blah. And there were some kind of like once-in-a-lifetime things that I look back on now, and like for one of them, once again, it's not a big deal. It's not the end of the world. But it was a comedian of mine that I really liked, and he ended up passing away. I had the opportunity of seeing his last show ever, and I turned it down. Well, who would know, right? I didn't know.
Yeah.
But still, you realize like there are just some cool experiences and things that like spending time with people or seeing something that is cool for you that, sometimes like you just can't get those things back. And I'm like, do I really miss the whatever, like $150, whatever, $200 I missed? I would have missed out if I would have gone to that. No.
Yep.
I mean, I wouldn't have thought about that now. It's kind of like you can always get more money.
Mm-hmm.
God can always bring you more money, but you'll never get more time.
Yeah.
That's never going to happen.
Yeah.
And so I think just it's made me realize like time is so much more valuable than I realized. And I think when I was here, I possibly neglected my studies for the sake of relationships with friends. But so I don't think that's right either. I'm the opposite extreme.
Yeah.
But I do think those are the things that I'm really thankful for now, is like that I did spend that time with people and I have those friendships. So that's interesting. Discipleship, I think that has a lot to do with the church, getting plugged in at a church. And then also, like I said, spending some time with your professors. I mean, if you're still in college, some of these guys, most of them are retired now.
Yeah.
And thankfully, like they're very kind and generous with their time, and they've, agreed to come on the podcast and do conversations and stuff. So that's a way I can still have those conversations. But yeah, if you're still in school, I think that's huge.
Absolutely. And, I had great relationships with my professors. In fact, the church that I'm in, it was because of one of my professors. He wanted me to be part of this. He's also an elder now at the church. But you're right. I mean, there's just so much wisdom, and they're there to kind of pour it on us. The next generation. And I think it makes sense to really use them well.
Yeah. Well, Ajit, I appreciate you taking the time and you coming all the way down here. And
my pleasure.
It's been good to see you again, man.
Good to see you again, my man.